At 2:17 a.m., the apartment seemed to hold its breath. The refrigerator hummed like a distant highway, the baseboard heater clicked and cooled, and somewhere on the other side of the thin wall a neighbor coughed twice, then settled. Lily Harper woke inside that hush with the distinct certainty that time had snagged on something invisible. Her neck throbbed in a way that did not belong to ordinary aches. It beat with a private rhythm, a small drum under the skin, answering a pulse she could not slow. She lay still, the ceiling blurred by the milk-glass dome of the fixture that never worked quite right and tasted the coppery dryness of night air. The spot at the side of her neck had been a nuisance at dinner, an itch she tried to forget while her mother scraped plates and filled plastic containers with leftovers. Now it felt larger, as if a tiny marble had been tucked beneath the surface and warmed by her sleep. She thought of the science unit at school diagrams of blood vessels printed in blue and red, and imagined a map of rivers converging at a lake that had not been there yesterday. Lily reached for the small flashlight she kept at the edge of the bed, the one Noah had let her choose from the hardware store years ago, because it fit her hand perfectly. The light flicked on with a tired cone, and she cupped it inward, careful not to wake her mother. The room showed itself in thin slices, the sketchbook splayed open to a half-finished dragonfly, the thrift store dresser with a missing knob, the tiny enamel pin shaped like a crescent moon that she kept on the windowsill for luck. She slid from the warmth of the blanket and padded across the patch of rug worn slightly bald in the path between bed and bathroom. The mirror over the sink had a small crack like a river delta at one corner. She tipped her chin, angled the light, and found the swelling with a kind of stunned curiosity. The skin looked tight-flushed with a bloom that pressed outward, and at its center a darker point hovered like a seed. She had scraped it that morning with the edge of a finger, then felt guilty, then forgot. Now the skin seemed thinner than paper. When she swallowed, the motion tugged at the place, and the place tugged back. She focused more closely and saw at the faintest ripple a subtle shifting under the surface, as if a thought had traveled through the skin and left a wake. Things do not move there, she told herself, not like that. But the ripple came again, an almost imperceptible nudge from inside out. The edges of her sight gathered a ring of static. She steadied the light with both hands and watched as the dark point in the middle softened into the suggestion of a slit. Nothing happened for the length of 3 heartbeats. Then the slit widened not so much with violence as with intent, and something hair-thin and dark tested the air no more than a lash, no wider than a thread appearing. Retreating, appearing again. The sound that left Lily's throat was not a scream, so much as a surprised inhalation dragged to sharpness. Air fled her chest, returned, fled again. Grace Harper was out of bed before she remembered being awake. The space between mother and child was a corridor she could move through blind, and she did feet finding their old roots. Grief had made her acutely aware of distances, how far from the couch to the door during Noah's deployment. How many minutes from the bus stop to the shift at the clinic she could no longer keep. How hard it was to cross from the past to the present without tripping on what used to be. She arrived in the doorway, hand on the frame, and saw her daughter small and white in the bluish light, the flashlight trembling against porcelain. It is a mother's chore to sort alarms. Grace did it the way she had learned to do everything in the 2 years since Noah's convoy took a wrong road in a country still warring with itself silently thoroughly with a steadiness that mimicked certainty. She was careful with the light, careful with the tone of her voice, careful with the sudden memory of the clinic's supply closet where gauze and antiseptics had once been her daily language. She hated the part of her mind that clicked back into that vocabulary now uninvited. The swelling had the glossy sheen of overripe fruit. Heat radiated from it in a way heat does when the body decides to fight. The slit in the center was barely there, and yet undeniable. Grace saw the suggestion of movement without naming it the way the surface of a lake betrays the fish beneath. She thought of the creek behind the building, of the summers when Lily would return with shoes damp and legs freckled by bites, of Mrs. Aldridge's quiet voice from across the hall saying, "There are things in that water I don't trust, dear." She steadied her breathing, knelt, and touched the skin near, but not on the swollen place. Lily shivered under her hand, then stilled. morning makes liars of nights like these. That is what Grace told herself when she guided Lily back to bed, when she pressed a cool cloth to her forehead, when she noted the absence of other signs, the ragged breath, the delirium, the cascading red lines she had once memorized from textbooks and hoped never to need. Morning would arrive, and the swelling would look ordinary again, she bargained, and she could call the free clinic from behind the counter at the gas station and speak in a tone that suggested she was not frantic. There would be a slot open, a favor to be cashed, a kindness extended. She lay on the edge of Lily's bed until the girl's breathing found a slower rhythm and the flashlight dimmed to a weak glow and died. In the quiet, images drifted like the thin snow that sometimes fell in February and surprised the city. Lily at 7, building a fort out of cardboard boxes. Noah teaching Lily to tie a bowline with a piece of clothesline at the kitchen table, the day the letter arrived with words that were polite and impossible. Grace still wore her ring on a chain during the day and slid it back onto her finger at night as if vows could keep time from unraveling. She thought about the bills lined up like stern faces on the counter, the rent, due the manager's voice telling her the schedule had changed. She thought about the way Lily's shoulders had grown narrower in the last year, not with weight lost, but with weight carried. The heater clicked on. The room warmed by a degree, maybe 2. Somewhere down the hall, a television murmured. Grace closed her eyes and let the shape of her daughter's breathing anchor her. When morning came, it arrived in the gray way it always did in Pinewood apartments, filtered through blinds that did not quite close, dulled by the film that traffic left on city windows. The swelling looked angrier in daylight, the skin around it flushed to the edge of a bruise, but the tiny slit seemed to have sealed as if embarrassed by its own audacity. Lily moved carefully, a hand hovering near her neck without touching. She was quiet in the way children are when they are bargaining with their bodies. Grace made toast, then eggs when toast did not appeal, then tea when eggs did not stay. She composed the call she would make at noon, rehearsed the phrasing that might loosen a calendar. Before school, Lily lingered by the window, watching a sparrow worry at a ragged nest built into the crook of the downspout. The bird was relentless with its bit of string, then suddenly triumphant, then gone. The nest held. Grace set a hand on her daughter's back and felt the small vertebrae like stepping stones. She promised routine. She promised afternoon soup and the soft throw blanket that still smelled faintly of Noah's cologne. She promised without saying that she would not let the world sharpen its edges against Lily's skin if she could help it. Pinewood's stairwell carried the usual morning chorus, someone arguing softly into a phone, the clang of a mailbox, a radio spilling an old song into new air. Outside, the sky had the thin color of porcelain right before it cools. Grace watched Lily walk the short distance to the bus and counted each step. There is a moment after a small terror when the mind insists on a return to ordinary. Grace let herself have it. She cleaned the dish that did not need cleaning. She tucked the blanket just so. She picked up Lily's sketchbook and traced the unfinished wing of the dragonfly with her gaze admiring the way her child had seen the tiny architecture of flight. Only then did she stand in the bathroom again under the light that made everything honest and look at the mirror with the river delta crack. She did not flinch. She leaned in close and studied the place where the night had written its new rule. What she felt then was not panic, but the slow arrival of resolve, the kind that sets like plaster and holds a wall together long after the scaffolding is gone. There would be calls, there would be waiting rooms, there would be numbers she could not afford and decisions she could not avoid. There would be a creek behind the building that did not look dangerous and a factory up the road that did not look responsible. There would be a night she would remember by its exact minute. But first, there would be morning, and she was still here to meet it. If you're listening and want more true-inspired, slow-burn stories like this, remember to follow and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Morning in Pinewood Apartments never looked quite like morning anywhere else. The light arrived dulled as though it had been strained through layers of fatigue and soot before slipping between the blinds. Grace Harper woke with her body aching from a night spent half sitting at the edge of her daughter's bed, her head heavy with unspoken dread. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the smell of dust on the heater, the peeling paint above the kitchen sink. These were constants. But now they felt like the scenery of a stage, waiting for the next act, one that promised no comfort. She moved carefully, not wanting to disturb Lily, who still lay under the quilt. The girl's breathing was shallow but steady, her face softened by dreams that seemed fragile. Grace studied her the way a mother does when words are not enough. The thin arms wrapped around the stuffed bear. The hair clumped from sweat, the collar tugged slightly higher as though even in sleep she sought to shield the place at her neck. The swelling had not receded. If anything, it looked more insistent, a quiet presence that had claimed its place. Grace busied herself with breakfast, though appetite was unlikely. She spread peanut butter across bread that bent and tore boiled water for tea and slipped a folded note into Lily's bag. "You are stronger than you think." It was habit now, a small ritual she clung to in place of certainty. These notes were her silent prayers sent with her daughter into a world she could not always protect. The hallway outside was already awake. A radio played tinny pop music somewhere above, footsteps echoed against concrete, and two neighbors argued over laundry tokens in voices that traveled far. Pinewood was not cruel, but it was tired, and tired places have little patience for vulnerability. Grace felt the gazes linger as she guided Lily down the stairwell, one hand hovering near her daughter's shoulder as though to steady her. Mrs. Aldridge waited near the mailbox, a cane in one hand, a small bag in the other. Her eyes, sharp behind glasses, softened when they landed on Lily. "The child looks pale," she said, her voice carrying concern edged with quiet warning. She pressed the bag into Grace's hands. Soup still warm, and a wedge of cornbread wrapped in foil. "Keep her strong. Children need strength to fight what's hidden." Grace murmured thanks, her throat tight. She wanted to ask if the old woman had seen something, if her words carried more than simple observation, but Lily tugged gently at her sleeve, ready to move. They exchanged a brief nod, an unspoken pact between women who knew silence could be heavier than words. The school stood only a few blocks away, its playground fence bent in places, swings creaking faintly in the wind. Grace lingered longer than usual at the gate. She kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered the same promise she always did. "You are safe." But as she watched Lily slip into the tide of children, her chest clenched. The words no longer felt like a shield. They felt like a hope she was borrowing against time. On her walk back, Grace's eyes drifted to the skyline beyond Pinewood. The smokestacks of Langford Chemical rose like monuments, their pale exhaust curling into the gray sky. She remembered the day they had moved into the complex, the landlord assuring her that the plant was safe, inspected a steady provider of jobs. But she had seen the creak behind the building after heavy rain, the way foam clung stubbornly to its edges, the faint metallic smell that no season could disguise. She had warned Lily to stay away, though she knew curiosity had gravity stronger than caution. The rest of the day unfolded in its weary rhythm. At the Gas and Go, Grace smiled politely at customers who did not see her scanned barcodes until her fingers ached and stole moments to check her phone for messages from the school. Each beep of the register was a reminder of bills waiting on the kitchen counter. Each impatient sigh from her manager. A reminder of how little space she had to falter. Her body went through the motions, but her mind circled back again and again to the swelling on Lily's neck, to the way it seemed not to belong to the logic of ordinary illness. By late afternoon, she returned to find Lily on the couch, pale and quiet, her sketchbook closed beside her. She had drawn nothing that day, which said more than words. The swelling had grown slightly, the skin taut as though testing its own strength. Grace touched the edges carefully, feeling the unnatural heat radiate outward. Lily winced, but did not complain. Children adapt quickly, but adaptation is not always safety. That evening, whispers reached their apartment. In the stairwell, Grace heard two voices. "That little girl's sick. Her mother should take her in before it's too late." The words were not malicious, but they cut just the same. Poverty always came with an audience. Grace carried the weight of both judgment and fear as she closed the door behind her. Night fell heavy, the ceiling low with shadows. Lily drifted to sleep, clutching the bear, her small body curled defensively. Grace sat at the kitchen table, soup untouched before her, staring at the bills stacked neatly but accusingly. Rent, utilities, the overdue balance from the clinic. She pressed her palms together, feeling the tremor in her fingers. She thought of Noah, of his laugh echoing through these walls before they hollowed of the folded flag above the mantel. He had been her anchor, and now she drifted in waters that threatened to swallow both her and their daughter. From the living room came a small sound, Lily murmuring in her sleep. Grace rose, heart pounding, and leaned close. The child whispered words half swallowed by dreams. "It hurts inside." Like chewing. The sentence was fragile, almost lost to the dark, but it landed with the force of truth. Grace pressed a trembling hand against her daughter's forehead, her heart clenching. She whispered reassurance, though each word tasted false. The night pressed on, heavy with silence. Beyond the apartment walls, Pinewood carried on as it always had, tired, bruised, enduring. But within Grace's chest a line had been crossed. The swelling was no longer just a mark to be watched. It was a clock ticking louder with each breath. And as she sat beside her daughter watching the small body shift under fever's touch, Grace understood that ordinary explanations had slipped from reach. Something hidden had awakened, and denial would no longer keep it at bay. If this story grips you, if you want to follow every chapter to the end, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us. More truths are waiting in the shadows. By midweek, the air in Pinewood had that particular weight it got before rain, thick metallic, as if the clouds had learned something troubling, and were hesitating to let it fall. Grace Harper moved through the morning like someone learning to breathe again after surfacing too fast. She kept a hand near Lily's shoulder without touching the way one steadies a glass already full. At school, drop-off, the tide of children parted around them. Their noise was ordinary backpacks, thudding sneakers scraping the rise and fall of voices. But inside that ordinary sound, Grace felt the hush that follows a rumor. Adults are careful with their faces when they speak about children. Pinewood learned its caution the hard way. Still, words travel. The building custodian, sweeping grit from the curb, paused and watched them cross. Two mothers' heads bent together near the gate did not quite whisper, but softened their voices as if lowering volume could soften meaning. A teacher's smile lingered a beat too long, becoming a question without asking one. That was how a story took shape here, not with accusations, but with glances that stayed. Lily moved slowly. She kept her chin tilted to avoid the tug in her neck, and every few steps she pressed her lips together as if to quiet something inside that wanted out. Grace felt a quiver pass through the child's frame when a gust of air found the back of her collar. She felt the shiver in her own ribs in answer. They were both learning a new vocabulary of small reactions. At the gas and go time, flattened into a strip of barcode beeps and dollar bills that still smelled faintly of cigarettes. Grace had rehearsed the call to the clinic, then placed it, then waited on hold while the same apology cycled across the line. The earliest slot lived on a calendar page she could not reach. Urgent care would see Lily for a fee that might break the month. The emergency room was a different price, entirely measured in numbers and in judgment. She stood behind the counter and felt the old life press against the new. The remembered steadiness of her hands in a clinic supply room, the certainty of sterile packs and protocols, the way the body gave up secrets if you asked it properly. Now she asked an automated voice for mercy and got music instead. She checked her phone too often, then berated herself for checking, then checked again. When the school number finally lit the screen, the breath she'd been rationing vanished. The nurse's tone, professional kind, waited settled in her ear. Lily had drifted through morning classes like someone walking underwater. Headache, low appetite, difficulty focusing. No rash beyond the swelling, no dizziness, no fainting. The nurse did not use the word concern, but placed it gently inside every sentence. Grace thanked her and promised to monitor. She said the word monitor like a person who had authority over the thing being watched. In the afternoon, the sky finally opened and rain came in a thin, persistent curtain. It felt like the city was being rinsed, though everyone knew how rinses work. They remove what lies on top and leave the rest to seep. Grace collected Lily early and guided her home beneath a borrowed umbrella, the two of them moving like a single shape. The stairwell smelled of damp concrete and chlorinated laundry of lives overlapping. Mrs. Aldridge's door opened a crack as they passed. The old woman's eyes shone with something that was not pity. She lifted her cane in a small salute, an old soldier acknowledging another. Inside, Lily curled on the couch with the quilt drawn up and quieted herself with the kind of small tasks a child invents, aligning colored pencils by length, folding the corner of a page until it made a triangle, counting breath with the low seriousness of a ritual. When the ache in her neck sighed into words, they came like a report from a country she did not want to visit. It hurt inside, she said once in the careful tone people use for weather, then later said nothing but lifted her hand without thinking and held it above the spot as if to muffle a sound only she could hear. Grace watched without staring. She made tea and set it within reach. She opened the window a fraction to peel the air. She moved through the small geometry of care, blanket, cup, touch like tracing letters she could write by heart. When Lily's eyes slid shut, Grace stared at the wall clock and watched its second hand sweep in patient increments. Waiting is a profession. She had not chosen it, but she was getting good at it. The rain slowed. Afternoon thinned into that gray margin the day keeps before surrendering to night. Somewhere, a siren wound itself up, traveled past and unwound again. In the pause, it left a memory rose uninvited, the summer creek days when Lily's ankles came home ringed with mud and her laughter dried on the porch rail, the white seam of foam that sometimes stitched itself along Pinewood Creek after storms. The smell Noah had called battery rain, half joke, half warning. The city had issued a pamphlet, once colorful, optimistic, about industrial partnerships and safety milestones. Grace remembered the way the pamphlet felt between her fingers, too glossy for truth. Evening came with the grocery list she could not afford to ignore, and a conversation with her own pride that she had postponed too long. She asked the neighbor down the hall if she could spare a ride to the discount pharmacy and traded 2 nights of laundry help for the favor. The ride was quiet. Rain scaled the windshield in narrow ladders. The wipers counted time. Pinewood slid past in a collage of decisions made by people who did not live here. When they returned, a padded envelope leaned against the apartment door, beaded with rain. No return address, just their names in block letters that aimed for formal and landed at anonymous. For a second, Grace thought of student fundraisers and discounted magazine subscriptions, the small economies of a school desperate to fill gaps. She set the bag on the table, peeled the tape with her thumbnail, and tipped the contents into her palm. A small teddy bear tumbled out, worn to softness, patched carefully at one seam with thread that did not match. The smell was faint and kind old cotton, a shelf that had held books. Beneath it lay a folded note. She opened it with a care she had not planned and read words that arranged themselves into a bridge she had not allowed herself to cross. He carried this when he could not carry the world, the letter said. Thought his girl might keep it when he could not keep every promise. M. For a moment she let the idea rest that objects could transport fidelity across absence, that softness might do what muscle could not. She placed the bear beside Lily's pillow and saw the child's hand asleep find it by instinct the way roots find water. The night lengthened. The swelling at Lily's neck sat like a new planet the body had not yet learned how to orbit. The pain came and went in pulses that made the child's breath hitch and even out-hitch and even out. Grace sat with a notebook open to a page where numbers lived, rent, hours, miles, and on a smaller line began listing the other measurements, degree of heat frequency of ache color changes noted by the bathroom light. The adult world wanted budgets. The mother world wanted data. The desperate world wanted a sign. When the wind shifted near midnight, the building sighed in a way old buildings do, as if settling into their decades. Grace stepped into the bathroom alone and faced the mirror with the river delta crack. She pressed her fingers to the porcelain sink that had outlived at least 3 lives before hers and told her reflection what she would not say aloud. This was no longer a matter of endurance. The future had arrived in a small and particular way and wanted choices more than hope. She returned to the couch and slid down beside her child. The bear lay tucked against Lily's chest. In the intervals between the furnace's clanks, the building's drip, and the city's far-off movement, Grace heard the sound that begins before a decision is made, the quiet turning of a key inside the body. She did not yet know which door it fit. She promised herself she would find out. Night returned like a tide that refused to check the moon. By 10, the radiators were clicking their old code, and Pinewood's stairwell had quieted to the scrape of one late neighbor and the distant thud of a door that never quite latched. Grace Harper moved through the apartment with the care of someone carrying a bowl filled to the rim. Every small sound felt like a choice. She dimmed the lamp, set a basin by the bed, folded a washcloth until its edges met perfectly. Ritual was how she kept panic from inventing 100 versions of the future. Lily slept, but it was a sleep threaded with heat. Fever polished her cheeks and made the fine hairs at her temples shine. The small rise at her neck, last week's curiosity, yesterday's worry, had become the room's center. Even in shadow, it drew the eye. The skin was taut, the color pushed toward an angry rose, and beneath it something kept time. Not the steady drum of a heartbeat, but a patient tapping, as if an uninvited guest were learning the shape of the house. The city rumbled its indifferent lullaby outside. Siren wind the brief hush before a freight train muttered across the viaduct. Grace dipped the cloth and laid cool across the fever. She counted lifted rung and replaced. She watched the second hand sweep, then start again. In the half-light, she could almost pretend the night would be persuaded by care alone. Almost. Dreams came for Lily in waves. They arrived with the stiffening of small fingers around the teddy bear, with a murmur that was too low for words, with a flinch she seemed to swallow. In one, she shivered violently and turned her face into the pillow the way a swimmer turns away from glare. In another, she reached up without waking and pressed her palm a breath above the swelling, as if listening with skin. When she surfaced between them, her eyes opened to the color of the ceiling and closed again. The fever rearranged time. Grace recognized this terrain. Years ago, in fluorescent rooms whose clocks never changed expression, she had learned the texture of long nights, the patience, the bargaining, the inventory of possible next steps. Now there was only this small bed and the quiet brink where a mother chooses again and again not to break. She set a glass of water within reach. She lined up the bottle of children's ibuprofen with its measuring spoon, then decided to wait for the next interval. She adjusted the quilt by inches, smoothing tucking, letting the hands busy themselves so the mind would not go too far ahead. At almost 12, the building breathed in a new draft, and the air thinned as though the night had leaned closer. Grace rose to check the window, and in the bathroom caught her own reflection, the smudge of fatigue, the hair that would not obey the line of worry newly taught to her mouth. She stood a moment and steadied herself on porcelain that had survived tenants and time. When she turned to go back, a small sound came from the bedroom. Not a cry. More like the quick intake of breath when something unexpected brushes the skin. She crossed the room in 3 steps and saw at the smallest shimmer of movement at the center of the swelling a dark dot that seemed to widen and narrow with no rhythm she recognized. It might have been nothing, a trick of lamplight. The eye wants reasons. She leaned closer. The dot shifted a blink, a flutter, then quieted as if it too were listening. Grace did not speak. Words felt like a surface she could not trust. She breathed slowly and reached for the gauze she had set aside, the antiseptic she had bought with laundry quarters. She did not touch the center. She circled the edges, checked color and heat and tenderness as if assessment could be a spell. The skin pulled back from her gentlest pressure. The body knows when it is asked to make room. She needed to wash the bear. The thought arrived fully formed, not because she believed fabric could carry fever, but because the world suddenly felt porous. She waited for Lily to sink deeper, slid the toy free with the delicacy usually reserved for diffusing what exactly. Memory. She carried it to the sink and, under the quietest trickle, pressed soapy water into the patched belly. Threads darkened cotton took on weight. She held it steady and felt a tremor run through her wrists, not movement, fatigue naming itself. She rinsed. She pressed. She wrapped the bear in a towel and sat it near the heater like a small, silent witness. When she returned, the fever had lifted a fraction. The line of Lily's jaw had softened. Her lips parted in the way of deep sleep. Grace touched her daughter's crown lightly and let the contact ground her. Then she sat and opened her notebook. On the page, she kept 2 columns, the left for facts, the time of each dose temperature as close as she could measure it, with a thrift store digital that blinked too fast. The right for the less measurable color restlessness the tapping she had begun to suspect was not metaphor. The left-hand column comforted, and the right-hand one told the truth. At 2:17, Lily startled awake with the kind of silence that is louder than a cry. Her eyes opened wide and found the ceiling. Her breath caught and released. The nightlight threw a gentle arc across the room. Grace lifted the washcloth, cool again, and pressed it in a circle around the swelling. The child's shoulders eased. From somewhere within a small tremor, and then stillness. The fever took a step back. For an hour, nothing happened. Sometimes that is a story too. When the hours want to advise you, they send a memory. Noah, at the kitchen table, sleeves rolled, hands stained with motor oil and tomato sauce in the same evening. The creek in summer, when the world smelled like sun-warmed weeds and something metallic she could never name. The school flyer about environmental partners and safety audits, the way the paper shone in your hand, brighter than the block it described. The time she told Lily not to wade past the painted rock, not because the water was deep, but because warnings belonging to adults had settled like silt. She closed the notebook, opened it again, and wrote one more line on the right movement observed central. She stared at the words until they were only shapes. At 4, the building woke around the edges, pipes ticking a neighbor's kettle, the cough of an old elevator deciding to be brave. Lily slept cooler now and turned onto her left side so that the swelling was more visible. Grace did not look away. If she could bear witness, perhaps the body would be persuaded to do the same for itself. In the blue before dawn, she made a decision without the ceremony of a vow. She would not wait for the calendar to offer her an appointment like charity. She would not measure her child's next hour against the accounting of a month. She would ask for help and accept the cost whatever language it used to announce itself. She would call the one person who might answer with action instead of apology. Her phone lay face down on the table screen, a dark glass. She turned it over and scrolled through names she had not tested in years. Hospitals scatter people the way storms do. Still, some names stay lit even after distance. Emily Green looked up at her from the past. A colleague once quicker and braver than the room, the kind of doctor who made scared parents breathe as if oxygen had been hiding behind her name. Grace typed a message and deleted it. She called instead. The line rang longer than seemed kind. Then a voice, rough with sleep and work, said hello. Grace did not tell the whole story. Nights condense emergencies edit. She said the words that mattered in a low, even tone. Child fever swelling movement cannot wait. The voice on the other end exhaled in a way that meant understanding rather than doubt, and answered with the sentences that build a bridge. I'm coming. Keep her comfortable. Do not press the center. I'll bring what we need. Grace ended the call and looked at her daughter. The sky had decided to try morning again. The bear, drying near the heater, watched like a little relic made to hold more than it should. She poured new water, laid out clean gauze, and opened the door a notch for the first half-inch of day. If this chapter kept you leaning forward, hit subscribe so you won't miss the next turn. Sometimes the smallest choice becomes the step that changes every room that comes after. By the time Emily Green arrived, the morning had already begun its weary shuffle toward noon. Pinewood Apartments wore its usual uniform of damp walls and tired footsteps. But inside Grace Harper's unit the air was sharper electric with expectation. Emily stood in the doorway a moment, auburn hair tied back in haste, a duffel slung across her shoulder. Her presence filled the narrow space like the first clean breath after stale air. She moved quickly, washing her hands at the sink, laying out sterile packs and gauze as though the apartment itself had become an improvised clinic. Grace hovered near the couch where Lily lay, curled her face gray under the fever's flush, her breath shallow and uneven. The swelling at her neck had doubled again, its surface slick with heat, the center a darkened bruise that seemed to pulse. Every instinct in Grace screamed to act and to flee at once, but she held still, letting Emily's calm dictate the rhythm. "Hospital," Emily said after a swift examination. Her voice carried no doubt. "Not tomorrow, not later, now." Grace's heart stumbled. The thought of emergency rooms of bills stacked taller than the girl herself pressed like a stone against her chest. But then Lily stirred her lips, parting with a faint whisper. "It's moving again." And the stone cracked into resolve. Grace nodded. "We go." The drive blurred. Grace carried her daughter in her arms, the small body, far too light head resting against her shoulder. Emily drove with the focus of someone who had lived in triage too long to waste seconds. Pinewood's streets gave way to wider roads, and the skyline opened. The hospital rose ahead, its facade sterile, its windows catching light like mirrors angled at the sky. Inside, the emergency wing smelled of antiseptic and rushing air. The hum of machines, the squeak of gurney wheels, the clipped speech of nurses all merged into a single current that pulled them deeper. Emily spoke a handful of words at the desk, the kind that opened doors faster than paperwork. Within minutes, they were ushered into a small room. Lily laid gently on a bed far too large for her frame. Monitors where clipped numbers blinked onto screens. Oxygen hissed softly. The fever burned at 103. A nurse's glance toward Emily confirmed urgency. Grace stood at the bedside, one hand clutching Lily's, the other gripping the rail until her knuckles whitened. Emily snapped on gloves. "Local anesthetic lidocaine, keep it peripheral. Don't rupture the core." Her words were calm but hard as steel. Another physician, Dr. Kwan, joined, setting instruments in order with swift precision. The room contracted to the narrow field of Lily's neck, the swelling now grotesque, nearly the size of a golf ball. Lily's eyes fluttered open. "Mom." Her voice was barely a thread. Grace bent low, whispering, "I'm here. Just hold on to me." The scalpel gleamed. Emily made the first incision with a surgeon's exactness, a thin line along the taut skin. It parted with a sick sound and pus spilled yellow tinged with blood. Grace swallowed against the rising bile, forcing her body to stay steady. She murmured into her daughter's ear words of presence more than meaning. Then movement. Not a tremor, not the twitch of tissue, but deliberate. The bulge shifted, pressing against the incision, and from within slid a glistening shape. Long black segmented it writhed toward the light as though desperate for air. "Oh, God," Grace whispered, the sound escaping despite her resolve. "Forceps," Emily commanded. The instrument pressed into her hand. She clamped the slick body, pulled gently, then harder as it resisted. Lily screamed, her body arching, small fists clenching around her mother's hand. Grace held tight, whispering, I'm here, don't look away." With a sickening pop, the creature slid free, nearly 4 inches long, thrashing in the open air. It twisted with obscene vitality, striking at the steel tray before being dropped into a sealed container. Nurses recoiled, but Emily's hands never faltered. She pressed around the wound again, eyes narrowed. "There's more." 2 smaller larvae emerged in the next half hour, each hidden in separate pockets, each pulled from beneath the fevered flesh with resistance that chilled the room. The air grew thick with the stink of rot and antiseptic. By the time the last was sealed away, Lily lay trembling but quieter, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow but steady. Emily packed the wound carefully, flushing it clean, sealing it with gauze. At last she stripped off her gloves, her shoulders sagging slightly but her voice steady. "She's stable for now. We got them out." Grace sank into the chair beside the bed, tears running unchecked. Relief and terror braided themselves into something she could barely name. She kissed her daughter's forehead, whispering, You're safe now." Across the room, the container sat on the tray, its contents still writhing, pressing against clear walls as though seeking escape. Grace forced herself to look because turning away felt like surrender. Whatever war had just begun, denial would not win it. The hospital room settled into the uneasy quiet that follows crisis, the kind of silence that does not soothe but waits. Lily Harper slept under the soft beep of monitors, her face pale yet peaceful, her chest rising with more certainty than it had in days. Grace Harper sat close, her chair pulled flush to the bedrail, her hand resting lightly on her daughter's arm. She could not close her eyes, not even for a moment. Too much had shifted in too short a time. The fever had broken, but something darker had been revealed. Across the room, the sealed container waited on a steel tray, its contents writhed against the plastic, a black, segmented body glistening under fluorescent light. Even outside a host, the parasite did not weaken. It moved with intent, twisting and striking as though the air itself were not enough. Grace forced herself to look to memorize its shape. She would not allow ignorance to disguise itself as comfort. Dr. Emily Green returned with her laptop balanced on one arm, her hair damp from the quick wash she had taken in the hospital restroom. She moved with exhaustion pressed into her shoulders, but her eyes carried the clarity of focus sharpened by crisis. She set the laptop down, pulled on gloves, and lifted the container closer to the light. Nurses had refused to stay in the room with it. Grace understood why. "It shouldn't be alive like this," Emily murmured, tilting the container gently. Botfly larvae collapse once removed. They adapt. They resist. They want. She placed the container back and began typing rapidly, her screen filling with charts, archived reports, images of known parasites from tropical regions. She compared segment counts, body shapes, respiratory spiracles, all while muttering under her breath. Grace listened, but did not interrupt. Science was its own language, and Emily spoke it fluently. Finally, Emily turned the laptop toward Grace. On one side was a standard botfly larva, bulbous, translucent, a creature of nature's grotesque efficiency. On the other, a magnified image of what they had just pulled from Lily Darker Leaner, its tissues streaked with irregular protein structures. The difference was undeniable. "This isn't natural," Emily said, her voice low but certain. "Genetic splicing, synthetic proteins. Someone tampered with insect DNA. And whatever they made, it found its way into Lily." Grace pressed a hand to her mouth, forcing air into lungs that wanted to forget how. "You mean someone made these?" Emily nodded grimly. "Not by accident. Too deliberate. Too engineered." Grace leaned back, her mind racing. She thought of the creek that wound behind Pinewood Apartments where Lily loved to crouch and sketch beetles. She thought of the days the water smelled wrong metallic of the strange foam that clung stubbornly to rocks. And then she thought of the factory Langford Chemical, its smokestacks a permanent horizon, the pamphlets boasting community investment, the landlord insisting water was safe. "Langford," she whispered. "It has to be." Emily pulled up another file, this one stamped with the faded insignia of the Environmental Protection Agency. 3 years ago, Langford Chemical was cited for runoff violations into Pinewood Creek. The report flagged bioresponse acceleration in aquatic insects. They promised corrections, paid a fine, and the matter disappeared. She scrolled further, but look, whole sections redacted. Someone buried it. Grace's stomach turned. So the creek where Lily plays, it's poisoned. Poisoned and more, Emily said, altered. That water is a breeding ground. These parasites shouldn't exist here. They shouldn't exist at all. The bear. The thought dropped into Grace's mind with the weight of revelation. She remembered the envelope with no return address, the stitched seam of the toy her daughter clung to. She had washed it, dried it, told herself objects could not carry fever. But what if the bear was not comfort at all but vessel? She rose abruptly, startling Emily. "The bear," she said, her voice sharp with sudden fear. "It came in the mail. No return address. Lily wouldn't let it go." What if Emily's expression hardened? "Where is it?" "In the apartment," Grace admitted, her voice breaking. "I washed it," but Emily did not let her finish. "Don't bring it here. Not until I can examine it. If it carried larvae, then someone sent it. Someone wanted Lily exposed." Grace gripped the bedrail, her knees threatening to give. The idea was too large, too cruel, but the evidence sat inches away, still writhing in its plastic prison. Denial was no longer a refuge. She looked at her daughter, fragile and sleeping, hair damp against her forehead, cheeks hollowed by fever. She looked at Emily, steady and unflinching, already charting the next step. She looked at the container, alive with something that should not be alive. Outside the window, the city moved on, traffic groaning, sirens winding their weary arcs, the world indifferent. But inside this room, truth had split open. And once truth spills, it does not return to silence. The hospital corridors had a way of swallowing sound, softening every noise into something distant. Grace Harper noticed it that evening as she sat by Lily's bed, the monitors steady now, the fever held at bay. Her daughter looked smaller than ever against the white sheets, hair spread like a pale crown across the pillow. Grace smoothed the quilt again and again, her hands restless, her mind unable to quiet. Emily Green sat at the small desk, her laptop open, blue light reflecting against tired eyes. She had spent hours cross-referencing parasite morphology with genetic studies, compiling a dossier that already looked too heavy for one screen. She paused, rubbing the bridge of her nose, when her phone buzzed against the desk. Unknown number. She frowned, hesitated, then answered. The voice was young, fragile, but fierce at its edges. Dr. Green. Please don't hang up. My name is Ava Langford. Grace turned sharply at the name. Emily's posture stiffened. Ava? Langford? Yes, the voice hurried on. Victor Langford is my father, but I'm not calling for him. I'm calling because I think I have what Lily has. For a moment the room seemed to tilt. Grace's breath caught. Ava's voice faltered, then steadied with will. It started as a sore just under my ribs. They told me it was nothing, just an infection. But I feel it move. I know it's the same thing. He brought in a private doctor who gave me injections, told me to stop complaining. But it's getting worse. Grace pressed her hand to her mouth. She could see Lily's face mirrored in the unseen girl's words, the fever, the whispers in the night, the way the body seemed to house a secret it could not bear. Emily spoke quietly. Why are you telling us this, Ava? Because he'll bury it, Ava answered, her voice trembling. He'll bury me if he has to. He knows. He's known for a long time. But if I stay quiet, more kids will get sick. I heard about Lily. I saw the pictures. I want to help. A pause, then a sharp inhale. I'll send proof. You'll see. The line went dead. Within minutes, Emily's phone buzzed again with a series of images. She clicked them open, and Grace leaned over her shoulder. The photos were brutal, a patch of skin along a rib cage, purple and swollen, the center dark with pressure. In one frame, a black filament pushed against the surface caught mid-emergence. Ava had not exaggerated. She was living the same nightmare. Grace turned away, nausea surging. She's just a child, she whispered. Emily's voice was steady, and now she's a witness. Before Grace could answer, there was a knock at the door. A man stepped in, tall, lean, carrying a weather-beaten satchel. His face bore the tired authority of someone who had seen too much and written it all down. Mark Reynolds. He introduced himself quietly. Dr. Green sent me files. I'm here because this isn't just your story anymore. It's bigger. He set his satchel on the table, pulling out folders thick with printouts, a recorder, and a small camera. I've covered environmental scandals for years, he said. But this? Parasites engineered to grow inside children. A corporation with ties to government contracts. If we can prove it, it'll be one of the biggest stories of the decade. Grace looked at Lily, then at the sealed container still pulsing faintly on the tray. The thought of cameras and headlines made her chest tighten. But then she thought of Ava's voice, trembling, defiant, willing to risk her father's wrath for the truth. Silence had nearly killed Lily. Silence was already killing Ava. She met Mark's gaze and spoke with a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. Then use us. Use me. Tell it all. Emily closed the laptop with a snap, her expression hardening into determination. We'll need more than testimony. We'll need evidence that ties it to Langford Chemical. Mark gave a grim smile. "Don't worry, I've been following Langford's trail for years. Now, with your proof and Ava's courage, the tide has shifted. He can't silence this anymore." Grace reached for Lily's hand, brushing her daughter's knuckles with trembling fingers. She whispered not to Lily, but to herself. "This time we fight." The storm did not come with thunder, but with screens. By morning, Mark Reynolds' report was live, a sleek 20-minute segment that blended Emily Green's science with Grace Harper's testimony and Ava Langford's trembling voice. The headline scrolled across feeds and television's Parasites in Pinewood, the hidden cost of industry. Within hours, it had crossed state lines. By noon, it was everywhere. Grace watched from Lily's hospital room, her daughter's hand small and warm in hers. She saw her own face on the screen, eyes lined with exhaustion, words measured but fierce. Emily appeared next, explaining in clinical detail how the larvae could not exist without deliberate interference. Then came Ava's recording, her voice breaking her breath, catching her confession impossible to mistake for fabrication. The effect was immediate. Parents across Pinewood stormed schools and clinics demanding answers. Protesters clustered outside Langford Chemical, their signs sharp against the gray sky. "Protect our children. Clean the creek." Langford knew. The factory gates once ignored became a stage for anger. News crews arrived in vans, their cameras swallowing every chant. Inside the hospital, Grace felt the ground shift. The whispers of judgment that had once trailed her now swelled into a chorus of support. Neighbors she barely knew sent messages of solidarity. Strangers mailed blankets and cards. For the first time, she did not feel alone. Yet, with relief came fear, because men like Victor Langford did not crumble without striking back. Her fear proved justified that very evening. Langford appeared on live television standing at a podium draped with the company's insignia. His suit was immaculate, his posture unbowed. He began with sympathy, his voice dripping sincerity. "These claims," he said, "are tragic misunderstandings. Children fall ill, infections spread, and fear magnifies what medicine can explain. My heart goes out to the Harper family, but misinformation helps no one." The cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions, but Langford leaned closer to the microphone, his smile tight. "My daughter Ava is unwell. She has been manipulated into saying things that are not true. I love her dearly, but she is being used as a pawn. This is not justice. This is exploitation." Grace felt heat rise in her chest. To see the man dismiss his own daughter's pain, to hear him call Lily's ordeal misinformation, ignited something deeper than anger. It was contempt. Emily muted the broadcast before the bile in the room became unbearable. "He's doubling down," she said. "It's exactly what cornered men do." Mark Reynolds, who had returned to gather follow-up footage, spoke calmly but with urgency. "That's why we push harder. He thinks his empire can shield him, but Ava's testimony changes everything. We put her on camera. Full face, no hiding. That will be the final blow." Hours later, Ava Langford did exactly that. Her video surfaced on social media, filmed from the dim privacy of her bedroom. Blonde hair, pulled back, eyes swollen from sleepless nights, she faced the camera with trembling hands but a steady voice. "My father lied," she said. "He lied to me, to you, to everyone. I am his daughter, and I am sick. You saw the pictures. You heard my words. This is real. And if he can do this to me, his own child, what do you think he'll do to yours?" The clip spread like fire. By dawn, the hashtags had multiplied. "Listen to Ava" trended alongside #Justice for Pinewood. The public tide had turned into a flood. Government officials, long silent, were forced to act. The EPA announced a new investigation into Langford Chemical. The Department of Justice filed subpoenas. News anchors debated not whether Victor Langford was guilty, but how far his influence had reached. The fortress he had built on power and silence was cracking brick by brick. Through it all, Grace stayed by Lily's side, watching the girl regain color, appetite, laughter in cautious doses. Each smile was a reminder of what had almost been lost. Each breath felt like defiance. Yet, even as victory loomed, Grace knew the shadows had not retreated fully. She thought of the way the parasite still moved in its sealed container, restless alive. She thought of Langford's eyes behind his polished smile, not afraid but calculating. And she thought of Ava, brave, but exposed, her voice now echoing in a world that could both protect and destroy her. Justice was closer than it had ever been. But beneath its light, darker roots still spread. Grace felt it in her bones. This battle might end, but the war, whatever had spawned those creatures, whatever greed had fed them, was far from over. And still she held her daughter's hand and whispered, "We made it through," because for now, survival itself was a kind of justice. If this story has carried you this far, don't miss what comes next. Subscribe, stay with us, and be part of every voice that refuses silence.